Welcome to a special edition of the Share Life podcast. We're in an ongoing series as part of the discovery process for my next book project, From the Garden to the Cross, how Jesus' harrowing mission shows us the way forward. In this discussion, we're reflecting on the moments where Jesus was presented to Herod after Pilate's initial investigation of the charges against him. I'm Jason Scott Montoya, author and creator, sharing stories and systems to live better, work smarter. Today, I'm joined by Jim, Ivan, and Craig. Jim, say hello.
Hi.
Jim Carwish is leveraging personal narratives to help organizations and individuals master their stories and fuel their success. Ivan, say hello.
Hey.
Ivan Alfaro is an experienced investor that empowers everyday people to build wealth through real estate. Craig, say hello.
Hello.
Craig Haney is a land developer focused on helping families achieve their dreams of living on their own property. He's also the founder of cablesandkits.com, and he also wrote the introduction to my second book for small business owners. So let's jump into the passage where after being presented to Pilate for execution, Pilate finds a way out of his dilemma, or at least a distraction, sending Jesus to Herod. We'll read and discuss my harmonization of the story, and then we'll explore the story through the following questions. What can we learn about Jesus, humanity, and ourselves from this moment in the passion of Jesus? And how does it apply to our lives today? For those just now following along, this event takes place after Jesus' agonizing prayer in the Garden of Gethsemane, after his arrest and betrayal by Judas, after a night of scheming to find a way to sentence Jesus to death by the religious leaders, the 3 denials of knowing Jesus by Peter, the death of Judas, and prior to the moment Pilate is asking Jesus what is truth. So I'm going to go ahead and read the passage. I've added a few little details into it from Luke, but this comes from Luke 23, 7 through 12, and a little bit from 15. So I'm going to share my screen as I read this, and we'll go from there. If I can figure out how to share my screen. All right, you all see my screen, the passage here? All right.
Yeah.
When Pilate learned Jesus was Galilean, he sent him to Herod Antipas, who had John the Baptist beheaded. Since Jesus was under his jurisdiction and Herod happened to be in Jerusalem, delighted by his presence, Herod finally got his wish to meet Jesus, who was hoping to witness a miracle or a sign like the stories he had heard about. But Jesus refused to answer any of his many questions or perform any act. All the while, the religious leaders continued shouting their hostile accusations at Jesus. Offended by Jesus' silence and inaction, Herod joined in and verbally chastised him. Herod's soldiers joined in on the mockery and ridicule. Then they dressed Jesus up in a royal robe and sent him back to Pilate. Enemies before that day, Herod and Pilate became friends. Both Pilate and Herod determined Jesus was innocent of his charges and didn't deserve the death sentence campaigned for by the religious leaders. So this is the passage we're going to discuss. If you want me to pull it back up, just let me know. I'll share my screen again. But anyways, I want to go around and ask each of you, when you think about this moment with Jesus being presented before Herod, what is it that sticks out to you? What is it that you connect with or that offends you? Ivan, I'm going to go ahead and let you lead the way here. Take us from here.
Thank you, Mr. Montoya. So, this is speaking a lot to the human condition. I feel a lot of what we're going to cover. So I wanted to start with kind of my research I did on Herod Antipas.
Yeah.
You've been pronouncing him a little differently. I called him Antipas.
Well, I probably have it wrong. I think Antipas might be right. I think I've heard that before.
I'm just going to break it down into my summary, beginning, middle, and end of this guy.
Yeah.
He married the first wife, clearly for lineage and political gain. So I'm sure his father was very proud of that moment. However, shortly thereafter, he divorced her for his own niece. And it gets better. It's his brother's wife. That's the niece. So he took his brother's wife, who is still a family member. Father was clearly upset about this. He updated his inheritance to put him way down on the list, pretty around that era. So that's the beginning. The middle, he tried to please his father clearly by building big projects throughout the cities and things like this. So what would we call that? Trying to work your way into acceptance, right?
Yeah.
let me see, father cut down his inheritance just
Yeah.
a couple days before he died, even more. So like a quarter.
Now, and his father was the Herod that we know that killed all the babies, right?
Oh yeah, Herod the Great.
Yeah.
And wanted to kill Jesus
when he was unsuccessful, and when Jesus fled to Egypt with his parents.
Correct. Let me see. Wars were started eventually from that initial divorce because there was grievances coming out of that took time to come to fruition. And then the end of his life, a Roman leader was supposed to go help him with those wars that happened, all those grievances, but ended up saying, basically, never mind, I don't really care about you, and I don't have to do this anymore. You're on your own.
Yeah.
Lastly, his nephew, Agrippa, basically put some gossip in the air to the new king of Rome and made him just go into exile. So he died with no wife, no children, no land or country. So that's a basic timeline of him.
Yeah, the other thing I'll add is, with Herod, you mentioned his familial relationships with his niece. That was actually one of the things that created a hostility between him and John the Baptist. Was John the Baptist essentially calling him out for what he was doing was wrong.
Yeah.
So when you think about this moment in Christ, I kind of think of this as like the halftime moment of Jesus, because he's with Pilate in the trial, and then Pilate sends him to Herod. It's halftime, and then he goes back to Pilate, and it's the second half of the trial. So, but when you think about this moment, what is it that sticks out for you, or even just what do you think about Herod and how that connects with you, or doesn't?
I'd like to go kind of verse by verse to answer that. I guess I could start just by addressing one verse.
Yeah, pick one that you want to start with.
Just the beginning 7. So I noticed in the King James Version, Pilate said, as soon as he knew he belonged to Herod's jurisdiction, kind of just sent him there. Mm-hmm. So it was just interesting that, to me, that kind of seemed like a fearful type move.
Yeah.
Like he's not really sure. So I think that speaks to the human condition too, of like, there's a lot of consequences here. So that's just my comment on that one so far.
Yeah. Jim, what sticks out to you in this passage?
Well, I've been on 2 of these previous, and in this particular case, because my expertise is in story, is in narrative, that's what I lead with, right? That's my first reaction to almost anything is, what is the narrative that's going on here? Why are we hearing this story? Why is this story important? And in this particular one, I would
add, just make a comment. Mm-hmm. This part of the story is only in Luke. None of the other Gospels mention it. So that's an interesting point there as well.
So this is, as storytelling goes, if you look at it from one direction, this is a non-event. If you were a playwright, if you were a movie writer, a screenwriter, if you were looking for something to cut out of the story, this is the thing that you would cut if you look at it from one direction, right? Because in this particular moment, very little actually happens. There's very little action. In fact, it's rather disappointing, especially from the perspective of Herod. So what you're thinking might happen if this is the first time experiencing this story, you're thinking, okay, well, he got out of what's going on with Pilate. There he's in front of somebody that theoretically could be a pretty big fan of Jesus. He's like, oh boy, I'm going to get to see a show. There are things that are going to happen. And what happens in this particular moment is nothing. Right? I mean, what Herod does to him is he ridicules him. They dress him up and they send him back. But what really happens here is nothing of importance. But what doesn't happen here is what hit me. The things that don't happen but could have happened in this moment to completely, things that he had every possibility that this was, okay, you know what? The other person doesn't want the responsibility. They send him over here, you make the decision. All he really had to do was a little bit of song and dance. All he had to do is just say, oh yeah, I do miracles. Here's one. And he's like, oh, he could be like, yeah, very good. Very good. You know what? Yeah. You're free to go. I absolve you of anything. You go about it. So so the fact that and in this particular story, this is the only of the four gospels, like you said, that includes this part of the story. It has to be important somehow that we tell this part of the story, even though nothing that's expected to happen happens.
Yeah.
So it's that he didn't say anything. He didn't do anything. He didn't answer his questions. He didn't show him a miracle. He didn't ask for a pardon. He kept completely silent
Yeah.
and just waited. He allowed himself to be ridiculed. He allowed himself to be questioned. He allowed himself everything was there, and all he had to do was anything, and he probably would have just gotten out of there. So that was, as a storytelling, if you were trying to put this on screen, you'd be like, do I cut this or do I not? And the Christian screenwriter is going to say, you have to keep it in, right? You have to, no, this is, Luke kept this in, and the reason is that look at what he didn't do. Every single inaction in this, in my opinion, is an action. He acted constantly. He did action after action throughout this part of the story, but it appears as an inaction if you don't know God's plan.
Yeah. That's interesting. Craig, what are your first thoughts when you think about this passage?
Well, the other guys have said several of the things that I had kind of written down and were thinking about, which doesn't surprise me. A couple of smart dudes. The one thing that I thought, though, is the fact that he got passed around. You know, what I thought when I read some of this was slightly different than what's been said, in that I saw it as Herod as well as Pilate had their assigned areas.
Yeah.
And I think that this went down in Pilate's area. So, you know, you get pulled over in, you know, a particular county or state. You're getting dealt with by those particular local authorities. But if, you know, you may get extradited depending upon what you did or what you were running from.
Yeah.
And I think in this scenario,
You should know from personal experience, right?
oh yeah, I usually just don't get caught. So no, if you, I was actually thinking on the way home, I have to drive into a different county by 1 mile and then back out of that county by 1 mile to get to where I live. And I literally had the thought, this just introduces a whole nother level of unnecessary exposure to another legal authority, like to have to go through a county to get home. And, you know, what if someone were speeding and then they cross over the line, and how does all that work? But anyway, so, but what I thought was okay, he comes to Pilate because the arrest happened in his area of responsibility. And you could tell that I think Pilate was almost relieved when he's like, oh, wait a minute. You know, this was, he's Galilean, then he really's got to go to Herod. The fact that later it says that they became friends, Herod and Pilate became friends, kind of, well, and it says they were at enmity with one another. I think in a way, Pilate sent him off to Herod because it was like, let me push this off on him. The other thing there about pushing him off, and I think in both cases why neither of them wanted to deal with it, is because it was, from what I remember reading at one point a long time ago, that one of the objectives of these rulers over Judea and the other areas was to prevent unrest. They didn't want the Jews to kind of create an unrest situation and meddle or interfere with what was going on in Rome, and so, or under Roman rule. So I think that a lot of this was, you know, do we deal with it this way? Do we deal with it that way? But no matter how we deal with it, the objective here is to please Caesar and to not allow this to make it that far and try to deal with the potential unrest. So I think at first he was sent to Herod because it was the district that Jesus belonged to. Although it was curious to me, like, how did that typically work? Like, just because he was from Galilee, if he committed a crime or an offense in a different district, then why are you sending him to the leader of the district that he's from and not necessarily dealing with him in the district that he's in?
Yeah.
That was curious to
Well,
me.
I guess that, I mean, does anyone have an answer? I guess my guess would be, when you commit a crime, in a global sense, they usually send you, you're kind of obligated to the country that you committed the crime in. So
Right.
yeah. So it's
Yeah,
interesting.
if you speed in Gwinnett County, I mean, where we're here in Atlanta, if you speed in Gwinnett County, you're responsible to the Gwinnett County courts and to the court system to deal with that fine or to pay it. Extradition usually occurs in the world that we live in. When you commit a crime in a country, you flee to another country, and then they're going to extradite you back for the crime that you committed in that particular place. In this scenario, the crime was really committed not in Galilee, but in the area of Jerusalem. So that was curious. The other thing is, I think that Herod sent him back because he's like, I don't find any fault in him. I think that if Herod had felt as if it was completely up to him, he probably would have just dismissed it and that would have been the end of it. But for some reason, he sent him back to Pilate. Yeah. Well, if Pilate had gotten rid of him, it should have been obvious to Herod, okay, he sent him to me. He finds no fault in him, so my decision is final. But for some reason, he sent him back. Yeah. That was kind of confusing to me.
I wonder, I guess what comes to mind when you say all that is if he thought of and acted as if Herod was more of like an advisor, like, hey, take a look at this situation and tell me what you think, and maybe there wasn't a legal jurisdiction in a commitments, but I don't know to answer that. But that is an interesting kind of angle. Is just there had to have been some kind of relationship enough to know for him to even send it to him, like even though they were enemies. I don't know if there was like something that happened that went down, and then this was sort of Pilate's way of making that up. But there was also an aspect of that where it's like, I feel like Pilate further confused or further put himself in that confusion of what he was going to do, because he didn't get anything to help him alleviate his own conflict in the situation.
Right.
I think it was just a political nicety.
Yeah.
Just like an act of submission, a bunch of leaders do that today. It was totally optional. And I think there was some laws about if you were originated in this part of Rome, probably take him back. But ultimately, I think he was a higher leader of Pontius Pilate versus Herod. So
I think it would, just for fun, I don't know that I truly believe this, because obviously my background, I haven't been to seminary, and there's a lot of little pieces of this that could make what I'm about to say incorrect. But just for fun to push back, I think that any point in time they could have just made a decision. They could have just done something, and he would have been in his right to just make the decision. And I think this is a really ancient version of political spin or storytelling spin or PR, where it's like, okay, I don't want to make this decision. I don't want this to be on me. I don't want to be the one who have said that this is, this guy is going to have to go to his death. So I think there's a certain amount here where he's like, okay, you know what? I got it. I can get this off of my plate because there's this technicality. I can put it on this guy's plate. And the other guy goes, I didn't get anything fun out of this. Back on your plate again.
Okay.
So
and what it makes me think of is I remember in a time at Noodlehead, there was someone I needed to fire, and I knew that's what I needed to do. I just didn't want to do it. And so I called a bunch of people to like figure out maybe there was a way out of this situation, but there wasn't. And I just had to deal with it.
Yeah. The part that gets me is that the very last thing that Luke says before we finish up this section, The reason I'm thinking this way is because of the way that you have presented this to us, chunk at a time. We're looking at all of these different things. So just in the telling of the story, if you were just rushing on through this, there are some things to note, some things to not really worry about and head on. But there's bigger fish to fry. But if you really just look at this section, there is this this moment when he clearly knows that he's innocent. Somebody else has clearly known that he was innocent, and both times they did not use their authority to do what was in that moment right. According to, if you know someone, if all you are is a legal person, and it's like, okay, it comes in, I look at this, nope, there's no fault, let him go. But in both cases, right, and to the point where it goes back to the first guy again. So it's back to him again, and he knows that he's innocent, and it's back in his court again. He's like, okay, well, now it's back in my court again. Well, and that's what
I think of. Jesus says, "I am the truth, the way, the life." But the truth, when you said that, I imagine like truth is like slipping through everyone's hands. They're just they can't grab it, and because there's something else that's driving them. Truth is actually being put aside.
Right. If this was not, if there was not God's hand in all of this, if there wasn't a plan in all of this, I think we would look at the story a little bit different. Like, what are you doing? What are you doing? What are you doing?
Yeah. Craig,
right.
What do you got there?
Yeah. Go ahead, Craig.
That's my blinker, by the way.
Okay.
Yeah.
The spoon. You have the spoon.
So, the spoon. Oh, I didn't get that in the email earlier. That just dawned on me. So anyway, I think back to like what I said earlier, that there was a tension between both of these leaders in trying to do justice versus keep the peace because of the unrest that could come from this entire situation and already had come from this entire situation. And I think that one of their chief objectives was to not let this raise to the level of Caesar. That they did not want to be allowing an unrestful situation. And I think the one thing that I've not taken the time to research and really never learned much about is the progression of the rise and fall of Rome and what all went into that in both directions. If it were known that, if you've got little fires going on all throughout your kingdom, then those little fires can turn into nightmares. And if you've got multiple of those things going on at once, it could ultimately create a tinderbox situation that could result in the downfall of a kingdom, right? So if
and I would add to that, just to add, is that the Roman Empire took very seriously insurrection. And that's the part of what came out of where the crucifixion came, was like, we're going to destroy rebels in the most severe way possible so that we prevent insurrection. So add that in there.
And I think that being the case, I know that the Jews were generally kind of, bubbled over here, and they're like, we're going to let them do some things that we wouldn't really allow in Greater Rome, but we're going to keep that kind of under control. And I think that that was a big part of it, is that Pilate and Herod were like, we don't find fault in this guy. But then, even though they both said that, the crowds roared, and the religious leaders roared, and they crucified him anyway. Like, it seems to me that was an insane, like failure of the legal system. Like, how do you have mechanisms and processes, but you're going to let a crowd of people cause you to kill somebody because they think that they don't like them? That was really strange to me. But I think that ultimately they gave into that, because if they wouldn't have, where would this have gone from a civil unrest perspective?
Well, and the other thing I would add, just earlier I don't remember which account it is, but it is mentioned in one of the earlier gospel accounts that Herod is afraid of the crowds. And so that's another dynamic here. That's you just hit right on the head. So
And afraid in what way? Like today, what we think of is afraid in a political way. You know, the one political side is afraid that if they do this, they won't get the votes, and the other one is very similar. Back then, I think that's an element of it. But honestly, they didn't have they didn't like, if, how do I put it? The security of the palace of Herod or whatever he lived in versus Pilate. They might have been fortified to a degree, but if you took 500 or 1,000 people and stormed it, there was probably a literal fright of being able to be dragged out of your own kingdom or your own house. So there may have been even more than just a political concern, but there might have been a literal safety concern.
Yeah. Jim, what were you going to say?
Well, as a question, I want to put this because I feel like Ivan mentioned this near the beginning, the human nature of this. But if they were to have just made a decision, and they were making a decision instead of a lack of a decision, if they had just done the thing that seemed like it would be best for this situation, even if it was wrong, even if they were sentencing a guilty man to death, if the right thing for this moment, right, if they were looking at it, they're like, oh man, I might get killed, or if they're looking at it, oh, I don't want this to go to Caesar, the fact that they had this tension back and forth between just going ahead and doing the thing, right? It seems like if this was just one guy and the whole crowd wanted it and they were afraid of him and they didn't want to make the decision all that much, but they knew they didn't want it to go to Caesar. And in the grand scheme of things, it's one guy. So if they really felt fearful, right? Deep down, if they had to make a choice, what's the right choice in that situation? What's the choice to make? And then it's a lack of choice, right? I'm not going to do anything. I do find it interesting. Ivan brought up right away the human condition, right? What is the human doing in this moment? But also,
Ivan, expand on that for us.
Oh my, there's a lot here. I guess we could start with there's we think we know better than God. That is foundationally the problem, I think, here too. If we literally,
like, if we were in charge, we would do this better than he did. Is that what you mean by that?
No, what I mean is, like, there's multiple violations going on versus the Bible. Like, even what Jim just said, God says, be cold or hot. Don't be lukewarm or I'll spit you from my mouth. Like, just make a decision, whatever it is. If it's bad or good, I'll deal with it. You know, so that speaks to our human condition. We're like kind of
waffling. We don't have
the backbone about the situation, right? But it's also the fact that our backbone is based on it's like, this is the equivalent of the human backbone without God, right?
Right.
So like
that might be a little generous there.
Yeah, exactly. So if we're not leaning on the actual Bible, right, which is much more thicker, we're just kind of going through the motions of like, oh, I'm afraid of what, but it really should be of like, dude, the Bible said don't kill people, especially if they're innocent. Like, this is ridiculous. Like, God will smite them if they're killing innocent, or we'll just avoid the unrest. Well, maybe not. There may be a point to the unrest too, but just the human condition of like making all these complications for no reason. That's speaking to that. I also wanted to address kind of verse 8. Number 2 kind of things that kind of also violated the Bible on Antipas' side. He beheaded John the Baptist.
But when you say the Bible, you're referring to the Old Testament, or what are you specifically saying? Because at this time, obviously, the New Testament didn't exist. So
yeah, I was for the most part Old Testament,
or the moral law that's in our hearts, I guess.
Yeah, for the New Testament kind of reflects Old Testament things in an extent too. But there's 2 things. Antipas beheaded John the Baptist, which baptized Jesus. He had to have known that at some point, right? With all the people he has in his ear. And 2, his own father wanted to murder Jesus as a baby. So he wasn't honoring his father and like his desires to kill Jesus. He was just kind of lukewarm about it too. So I just thought it was a kind of interesting that his kind of lukewarmness was kind of a normal occurrence for him. Yeah. In verse 8.
Yeah. Craig, what were you going to say to that?
I was going to start off by saying something similar to you about the Bible. I mean, first of all, I mean, as you said, the Old Testament in various forms and manuscripts that were not all necessarily gathered together would have been the Bible they had at the time. But that only mattered to the Jews. These rulers,
they had their own
that
system.
was the bubble that was inside the bubble that they allowed to be the group of Jews, and they didn't give two hoots about what was going on with that. All they cared about was Rome, Caesar, unrest. Are you guys keeping it tamped down over there? And so I think if you look at the behavior of Rome, it was not the greatest behavior that we've seen in humanity. So
we would be appalled if we saw it today.
Yeah, of course. Yeah. I mean, like you said, the crucifixion as a method of death to punish people very publicly, very painfully, and very drawn out. I mean, you could kill somebody much, much faster and quicker, and with much less labor and effort. But it was brutal on purpose. They wanted to make examples out of people. And so, so I think that, any sort of instruction or guidance of God was of no concern to them. Yeah. But, so that was the main point that I was.
Got a quick comment on that.
Yeah, go ahead, Ivan.
There could have been a difference of intention as what comes to mind with that. Like the Romans have different gods, so they would, respect little rocks or whatever, little statues of things. So if they had an intention to actually explore, I guess, the Jewish God, they could have maybe gotten in the more cleaner direction per se, but instead they wanted to go praise this rock.
Yeah.
Well, and keeping in mind that, that God called Abraham and set in motion through him and his descendants a chosen people, and the Jews, as much as others may have rejected their beliefs, the Jews would have rejected anyone outside of Judaism. So, I mean, even Peter, was given the dreams or the visions of the sheep coming down with all of the unclean animals, and essentially told, the Gentiles can partake. And he's like, no way. And others were the same way as well. So my point is that not only would people have not cared to believe in what the Jews believed, the Jews didn't want other people to believe or to associate with what they believed, because they were high and mighty about the fact that they were God's chosen people. And really until the revelation to Peter, they really, it was an exclusive bloodline based salvation. With the exceptions that you hear of some people, the centurion and some others that were praised for their faith. We've not seen faith like this in all of Judea. I think that it was just generally understood that it was an exclusive religion, so to speak, a belief system, and I don't think Caesar or Herod or any of them had any interest whatsoever in looking at believing in or adhering in any way to that belief system. Yeah, which is kind of sad in a way that's kind of how it all unfolded, but that's the way that God unfolded it.
So I want to focus in on not just the first part, but the second part of the first part. Delighted by his presence, like Herod is kind of excited Jesus is here, and he wanted to meet him, and I don't quite understand that, because he kind of there's kind of like a love-hate relationship, it seems like, from the passages that reference this, and he's hoping to witness a miracle, and Jesus obviously he remains silent. Jim, what would you say to that in terms of we often we look at Jesus as a prop in our life, as this thing like, hey, Jesus, do this thing, or make this miracle for me, or heal this person, or help me get a job, or like we kind of use them as a pawn in a similar way. What would you say to that? Am I off the mark?
have my deeper reaction to that, my more where I want to get where I want what I say to have substance, but I also have my like human meter going, where we're petty, and we're if it could have as easily been, I can't wait for him to get here because I'm going to show everybody that his
Okay.
miracles aren't really miracles, right? Like do a trick for me. Okay, well, you turned water into wine. It's not really, you didn't really turn water into wine. You didn't really do that. You didn't. So it could have been to show that he couldn't do it. It could be to show here's the secret, like here's what's behind it.
Here's how the
But
magician works his magic. Yeah.
there was a there was a meme the other day that I saw, a short video where there was a crow or raven on top of a building, and there were two cats, and the raven was essentially going back and forth between the two cats, making both of, they were on two different rooftops, and the crow or raven was flying back and forth and making both of the cats angry, and the cats are getting closer and closer to each other, and eventually the crow flies up and the two cats fight each other. And for the remainder of the video, it's almost like the raven is kind of refereeing this fight that he created between these two cats. And back then there was a certain amount of entertainment, right? They didn't have TV. They didn't have all of these other things that we've got today. And so what is exciting about bringing this person closer to me is that, like, hey, we found a dog with two heads. Oh, bring him in. Bring him in. Show me the dog with two heads. Or we have a guy who claims he can do this magical thing. Bring him in here. Even whether you believe that he can or you believe that he can't, either way, you want to see it. And so if you haven't actually been in front of Jesus and said, what is this all about, right? Today there would be helicopters flying around with video cameras pointed at him or whatever. But he's just like, yeah, bring him in here. Yeah. This can be great.
It does make it feel or seem like a bit of a circus in that sense.
Yeah. It's like, let's make this. Yeah. Bring in the wine. Bring in the food. Bring Jesus in. Right.
Which is also to completely dismiss or to diminish the weight of who's in front of you. Like, this is God, but yet you're acting like it's an animal, right?
Yeah.
And also the weight of what Jesus is trying to do in terms of save humanity, right?
Yeah. The other part, and this is also still on this lighter side of things, right? But the idea that you said earlier that there was a halftime and this was halftime, then it makes me want to think this was a halftime show for him, right? This is like
Super Bowl halftime show,
Super Bowl halftime show. Get the snacks, get the food, get the wine, everything, and here's Jesus, and it's gonna be this really great thing. And it's kind of like, the lights come on, and the act just stands there, and you're kind of like, no, do the thing, right? Do the thing. No, well, fine. Answer these questions. Nothing. Just dead silent. Like what would we do if they said Van Halen was going to be at the Super Bowl, and then Van Halen just stood there in the lights without playing a note? Everybody was like,
you think kind of like Michael Jackson did, and then everybody
for like 30 seconds. Craig, what would you add to that? Just this idea that Jesus is there for our entertainment.
Yeah, I hadn't really thought about that, how, we have the internet now, and if we want to be entertained, we can go to TikTok or we can go to YouTube or whatever, turn on the television, watch a movie. And if you think back to, I can't remember her name, the girl that danced, that got John the Baptist beheaded.
Oh, the niece. Ivan, what's her name?
Yeah, I can't remember.
Herodias?
I was saying Herodias.
Herodias, yeah.
Is that it? Okay. How about that?
Yeah.
I can't believe I got it right. So, that's what came to mind when Jim was talking about that is, hey, let's set up this thing. We're going to have a party and this girl's going to dance. I'm sure there were other things going on as well. And it was an entertainment factor. And I hadn't really thought about that, where Herod is like, oh man, I've really been wanting to see what this is all about. That is quite interesting. And and I guess he was mightily disappointed when,
well, especially if he pulled everybody together, right? Still crazy speculation here on my part, but if you brought everybody together,
Jesus, you're supposed to.
It's like, you're the act. What are you doing? And so the moment where he gets angry at the end, and they dress him in a robe and send him off. Like he found no fault with him. He found him to be, he found him to be not doing anything that needed to be judged here. You're fine, go, right? Like that's my judgment. But he was excited to see him because of what he could do. He's excited to ask him questions. He found that he was innocent, and yet at the end he turns, lays into him, makes fun of him, ridicules him, yells at him, dresses him in this thing, humiliates him, and sends him out the door.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And I think part of that was exactly how you just described it, and for the reasons that you insinuated or implied or explicitly stated. But I think a part of it may too have been an attempt to appease those that had him show up there in the first place. Like, look, we've ridiculed the guy, we've punished him. We basically are doing the things that you kind of were doing or wanted to do. Is this making you happy? And there's no words there that show that was asked of the crowd, but that could have been part of it.
Just people pleasing
people pleasing, or again, kind of almost a peer pressure. Okay, we're at least going to flog the guy. We're going to make him a crown of thorns and shove it in his head and say, yeah, how about that king now? How do you feel about that? Stop doing this, that was maybe the message they were trying to send.
Well, and that's interesting because that kind of connects a lot of dots just in the whole story, just how much of a show this passion story is not just this moment. This is obviously part of it, but
I had thought about it earlier when it made it back to Pilate. I mean, Jim, you talked a minute ago, or maybe it was Montoya, about pulling a bunch of people together for this, him coming. That certainly happened with Pilate. I mean, he had called all the chief priests, all this, all that, all the other. I mean, you start imagining them and their entourage is showing up, and it would not have been a half a dozen people. It would have been dozens or perhaps even hundreds of people that would have been there and been around, not to exclude any that had been following Jesus's family or the disciples, or who knows who all was there out in the crowd or the fringes listening in on this. And I'm sure that these court sessions that were held were probably done in such a way. Well, they would have had to have been in such a way where people were able to gather around, because they were yelling out, "We want Barabbas!" So where were these people? They were somewhere. Yeah. And so the thing was probably laid out.
And it was Passover, and it was during the census. So there was probably a lot of people. I think it was a census, but it was at least Passover. So you had a lot of people aggregating for that.
Right. I want to jump in here real quick.
Yeah, go ahead, Ivan.
So I wanted to just a comment on the humanity and the godliness of Jesus in this very moment. In verse 9, it was I was just like, why is he not responding to him? There has to be a deeper meaning to this. So there's two that I found. It was, number one, he beheaded his BFF John. All right. Mm-hmm. How would you feel if I beheaded your BFF? That would not be cool, right?
Well, to face him face to face, like you killed, and that's actually one of the few times in the New Testament that we read Jesus wept, was after John was killed. So this was a big deal to Jesus, and yet it's there. It's the tension that we can see, but it's almost like Herod didn't even care or know.
Yeah. So there was the humanity part, and then the godliness part was that literally God doesn't listen to people that just don't care about him. In John 9:31, it says, I don't really hear you if you're not, with me. You're not believing in me if you're not having real relationship with me. So that was an interesting take on it.
Mm-hmm. In terms of, go ahead, Jim.
Mm-hmm. Well, I just the whole time, because this reinvesting myself in these stories section by section, because I've gotten to do 2 of these now and now the third. Each time that I've gone back, I'm reading a little bit before it, a little bit after it. I'm really paying attention to the passage that we're looking at for today. And each time I keep having this very human reaction of, but all you had to do was blank, right? So when we were looking at
all
the
you had to
people
do
that
for what outcome?
Anybody at any time, like this God's plan. Like God's plan is just going right along, just smoothly right along.
In other words, humanity's incompetence was at its max? Is
I
that
mean,
kind
it
of what
was every single thing that could have gone wrong didn't go wrong. But if you flip the story, everything went wrong, right? The story of Jesus is this tragic, horrific journey of everything going wrong. But what the important thing that we couldn't have go wrong as Christians, right? For God, Jesus, us, the thing that couldn't go wrong is he couldn't be freed. He couldn't not go to the cross. He had to go to the cross. This was the plan, right? This was
Yeah.
the entirety of
God's
what we're
plan.
doing. So
But
when
humans we had at every moment we had a chance to stop the
That's
tragedy,
right.
and
That's
no
right.
one did it.
and we could have. I mean, if you go back as far as them being in the garden together, and it was like, stay awake with me. Stay awake and pray and do these things, and they fell asleep. And so I'm like, okay, guys, come on. All you had to do was blank, right? And so every single human involved all the way through,
Including the disciples. Yeah.
including the disciples, you're just watching as this thing unfolds, and you're going, no.
What if they ate a big
nah."
pizza that night, bro?
Yeah.
Well, that's true. I didn't consider that, Ivan.
That changes everything.
That does change everything. So everybody that could have done something, including Jesus, right? Jesus could have performed a miracle. He could have done, like when somebody asked a question, he could have answered the question in such a way that got him out of the whole thing. He could have proven himself in a different way than was the plan all along, right?
And like you said in the garden, I can call a legion of angels and stop this. Yeah.
You totally could. You could have done this. So the whole time he's following this tragic path, brutal, horrible, back and forth, being tossed about by different courts and different people who are humiliating and doing all these things. The whole time, Jesus is doing exactly or not doing exactly the thing that's meant to happen.
Well, and that's kind of what I guess I imagine, like this trophy case of sin, like all the different kinds of sin idolatry and sin that we can do, and they all get manifested in this story.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely.
Well, the thing is, it's going to get worse because it's going to be a lot more stealthy for, the upcoming apocalypse, right? Where nobody's going to know what it is. It's going to be like an innocent looking leader. So it's going to be like literally like a snake in our midst.
Well, bring that a little bit more home. Like you're talking about being self-deceived. So how does that apply just in our day-to-day life and the relationships that we have and the things that we do and the work that we...
How does that apply? Like, that's a big ass question, man.
Like you're...
Yeah, Ivan, please tell us, Ivan, everything right now. Just come
give
on,
you
man.
all the answers.
Well, I
Give me all
think
the please.
You're speaking of something that it's so far apart. What I'm trying to do is, how does that apply to, like, you can kind of talk about the future and
so
year,
you said,
10 years.
Trophy case of sin and stuff
Mm-hmm.
that we're going on in this section. What I'm saying is we don't even, that's like 1 decimal point compared to what's coming next, right? We have things that we can't even properly discern when demons in our midst.
Mm-hmm.
We have like children right now that are being raised and, like this sin is normal. It's totally normal to be angry all the time and just be upset in a family situation. Like these sorts of stealthy things, the enemy is preparing little things that a lot of people are not aware of.
I like that comment. Yeah.
So and this is just fun debate pushback, Ivan, because you got put in an impossible situation with the question. But the thing for me as a Christian is we are going to see different examples in the future. We're going to see things where we say this is just a small fraction of it, but the truth of it really is that it isn't just a small fraction of it. We're going to see it manifest in it's going to become a Michael Bay film near the end, right? And there's just going to be horrific stuff, but the truth of it is that the sin, the whole kit and caboodle of why we had to have Jesus to begin with is laid out for us in this story. And yes, we're going to see different sin and it's going to manifest itself in crazy ways. But in truth, it's not really worse. It's just messier and louder and more apparent. And yet still humans at that point in time are not going to see it coming. right?
And to
So
the people in Rome, I mean, the apocalypse can't come. I mean, Rome it doesn't exist, right? So the empire fell, and there's been many other things that have fallen. So the apocalypse, there's a cycle of apocalypses, I guess is the way to say it. Craig, what is going on in you? You've been
yeah, I was going to say a minute ago, just kind of going back a little bit about Jesus's silence. I've thought about that off and on for years and years, that subject. And I really, we're more pondered like why was he silent? And I didn't think as much about it until we were talking about doing this session today. If he had said anything, it wouldn't have mattered what he said. They would have twisted his words or his actions. They would, if he'd have performed a miracle, they would have called it witchcraft. They would have done, they were already so hell-bent on crucifying him, they meaning the crowds and the religious leaders and everybody else that dragged him to this place. It wouldn't have mattered what he did or what he said. They would have twisted and turned his words or his actions against him. So to some degree, what's the point? To another degree, if he had spoken and could have been crafty with his words and maybe talked himself out of it, then, or well, let me back up. If he could have been crafty with his words and made a case for himself, but it not have worked, then that would have shown him to be not submitting to God's will for him to go to the cross. And it would have made him seem weak and begging and all of that, which that wouldn't have made any sense. And if he would have pleaded his case and would have actually talked sense into them, then he wouldn't have gone to the cross, which had been foretold since way back in the day and had been prophesied so many ways. Jesus was the fulfillment of the prophecy. Why would he, other than his moment in the garden, sweating blood and crying out to God, why would he or anybody have wanted him to have not gone to the cross? Because that's exactly what needed to happen. So
which is why Jesus calls Peter Satan, because he didn't want him to go to the cross.
In the way of the ways of God. Yeah. I mean, so, every which way I can think about it, it doesn't make any sense for him to have said anything.
Yeah, it was perfect. Yeah, it was perfect that he did that. The thing that brings to mind is if you've ever run a big event, if you've ever been in charge of bringing a whole group of people together for one purpose to do something like a church event or coming to see like putting together a band and having all your friends come out, no matter what it is, it's pretty hard to get humans to do any particular thing. Right? Like to get a bunch of humans aligned in a particular way. So if you think about it, God is doing this thing. He's got this event that the end result is that we are going to be forgiven, right? His son is going to pay for our sins. And he's God, so he can do anything, but he's not doing it in such a way where he just goes, and so your sins are forgiven. He takes this really long, painful, drawn out path where he is orchestrating exactly what needs to happen in order to, but at the same time, he's not orchestrating, right? Our own sin guides sin after sin after sin, guides Jesus down this path toward crucifixion. So God says, yep, I've got a plan. This is the thing that's gonna take away all those sins. And now I'm pretending like I know what God would say, but it's kind of the part of the message of this is your own humanity and sin is the exact playing space for this path, right? Exactly what is the reason that you need forgiveness. Here you go. All along throughout this story, just watch. These are all the reasons that you need forgiveness while you're watching it play out how we got forgiveness.
Yeah.
Step by step.
Yeah. And that's what I think of that trophy of sin. That's
this trophy case of sin is, I will not forget that, Jason.
With a river.
That will be with me forever.
Ivan, what would you add to that?
That was hilarious. That's what I would add. That was a great analogy. I mean, just enhance it, I could say is like he found a perfect parking lot at the right time, and God said, let me just park Jesus right here at this 1 in a trillion type moment, I think scholars have even addressed that too, like the exact timing of that happening, or whatever, 1 AD to 30 AD is like 1 in a trillion chances.
Yeah. What would you say about the silence? Would you add anything to that point? Jesus' silence and
from a human perspective, I think there's just wisdom. The most wise people I've known have done things with silence. Just, you don't have to say much at all.
Yeah.
Well,
and yeah, go ahead.
Yeah. Well, the thing that comes to mind is the power of our presence when we're silent. I was in so I've always wanted to do jury duty, and I've been called, and I've gotten to different stages, but I've never made it to the courtroom. But there was one time where we were about to go into the courtroom, and the fact that there was a jury that was about to go in the courtroom created a tension for the prosecutor and the defense to reconcile the situation, and so that we weren't actually needed. We had an important role. It just wasn't in the obvious sense. And so that's kind of what came to mind when you said that.
I think it's I just remembered something else totally irrelevant. But
yeah, go ahead.
When I would go to haunted houses a lot, because I was like a connoisseur of that.
Yeah.
The worst monsters are not the ones that are talking to you or yelling.
Oh, yes.
The ones that are like,
yeah. Oh,
hey,
man.
Really
The ones that give you nightmares are the ones that that are just, they move super slow and they turn their heads at you super slow. And you're like, oh, no. So I have one more question to ask, because if Jesus was without sin and he died without sin, any of the things that we have been wondering, like if he had done this or if he had done that, or if he had called angels down, or if he had given the truth, even if what was said earlier, even if they would have turned it against him, I wonder if any of those things would have caused him to sit. I wonder if he was silent in that moment, very specifically, because he's not lying his way out of it. He's not manipulating his way out of it. He's not doing anything that a snake trying to save its own skin would do. He's not doing anything. He's not speaking up. He's not showing what he can do. He's not He's not even just saying, "Hey, look,"
Well, and I would even kind of take that further in the sense that if Jesus was submitting to the Father's will, there are things that we might not think of sin, but if he was subverting God's will, that would have been sin. Right?
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
Definitely.
Yeah.
So
even
all the
that law too.
Yeah. So all the while through this horrific journey of Jesus, all of this pain and all of these things that are happening, and it's just playing out, and it's like we're wishing at any point in time for the story to stop there, right? It can't stop there. And meanwhile, he is maintaining his purity throughout that entire situation.
Yeah, and saying even one word could have been contempt of court.
Could have been contempt of court. Exactly. It could have been a contempt of court at that point.
And I think that's where it's there is something about, like, God is, to your point, Jim, he's pulling out our depravity. He's putting it on display. And I think, there's an aspect of, like, Jesus didn't do anything. He didn't say anything, but Herod goes from excited to see him to now he's joining in with the religious leaders, and he's mocking them and ridiculing Jesus just like they were. So he's double-minded in the sense that he went from happy to angry, I guess, in a way.
Something I hadn't thought about is I wonder over what span of time these meetings happened in. Like, when you read them, it seems like it was in 30 minutes, but
but this could have been a couple hours, is what you mean?
Well, could have been a couple hours, or could have been overnight. I mean, could it have been that? Certainly, if Jesus is being sent here and sent there, they didn't throw him in a limo and rush him over. I mean, so
Herod was in Jerusalem, so it was probably a distance, but it wasn't like a different area. But
Right,
yeah.
but I'm
Yeah.
saying there probably was some nighttime going on somewhere.
Yeah.
But it could have been that when he's in front of Herod, Herod may have had his time with him, and then maybe Herod goes to bed, goes to sleep, and wakes up angry. You know, like it may not have been in an instant. It may have
Yeah.
been maybe a nighttime happened. I don't know.
Yeah.
But that is interesting. I was trying to Google real quick, just something to think about. I can't quickly find the answer without spending a lot of time reading, but where BC and AD came from, the little bit I can see is we look back at all these events and we measure them in a calendar that we understand from this point. But in their time period, they didn't have BC and AD. They had whatever they had at the time. And so it's kind of like, Jesus. Jesus is not actually Jesus's name. Jesus is an English word to express Yeshua, or Yeshua, sorry.
Yeah.
So Yeshua would be his Jewish name, but we say Jesus because that's the word that we chose for the English language. So in the same way, the time period that all this stuff happened in, it wasn't really a BC AD thing. Looking back, it was BC AD. So anyway, those things, by the way, really, when you find those little nuggets when you're reading scripture and you realize that, things like, Yeshua and Jesus or BC AD and the time period, those things, they kind of make things make a little more sense when you're like, oh, I thought that was kind of strange, like why this was called that or why this was said this way. And it really,
well, and I guess the other thing at a higher level that comes to mind is just how transformative this event was, just even in our calendar. Like it completely, it went from just a linear calendar to like two halves. Like this is this milestone that split the calendar in a way, which is interesting. So I guess the last kind of part of this is just kind of jumping into the idea that Herod jumps into ridiculing Jesus and then they dress him up and send him off. I mean, it's that continuing entertainment type of thing. It's like, okay, if you're not going to speak, if you're not going to do anything, we're going to take control and we're going to make this fun.
I was like showing his insecurity, right? Like, you're stupid.
Well, and it makes me think too, if you have been reveling and drinking and partying, and then Jesus comes in and it's the big thing that this is the thing, this is the act that you've brought out, like this is the fun, and everybody's like, all right, here it comes, here's gonna be the thing, and it's disappointing. If you're intoxicated and you've got all of these your blood is pumping and everything, then at that point in time, for you to turn on somebody and then dress them up, I mean, if you look at hazing, if you look at all of the different things that we do when we're all riled up as humans, and we're all, we drink too much and we're on drugs and we're doing all these things, and then it's like, what? Why did you why'd you pick up that B&W and turn it upside down and throw it on the ground? Why would that group of people do that? That makes no sense. What's going on there? But it made perfect sense at the time. So if at the end of all this, they're all just like, you know what? Fine, you're not going to do it. Here's our show, and they're doing the show, and they're getting it ready or whatever. It's perfectly in line with God's plan, but they are like, well, we'll show you, we're gonna flip your car upside, we're gonna put you in robes, and we're gonna do these things, right? and then they send him out the door, like, showed you.
Yeah.
But right.
Yeah.
Uh-oh.
Craig, what would you add to that?
Nothing.
Or Ivan, do you have any thoughts on that matter?
Well, I made my comment. I was just like sounding like an adolescent bully.
Yeah. So I guess the question I would have then, Ivan, is, and then to y'all is, how do we apply this? Like, is this just something interesting for us to know? Is this something that shows us, like, is there an inner Herod in each of us? Is there something about Jesus that is worth us,
for sure. Like we act out all the time when we don't get our way, right?
Mm-hmm.
I know I go into sin when I don't get my way, especially because that's like my habit, my ritual. That's how I developed, that I am working out of my brain and my lobes.
Yeah.
For me, I have an exercise that I do in each one of these little chunks that
Is
we've
it
been
called the
doing.
Herod exercise?
It isn't called the Herod exercise, but we'll do that. We'll call it that, even though it isn't. No, the thing that I usually do is I just take myself as who I am today, not when I was younger, not what has, maybe I'll get a little wiser as I grow older, but I take me today and I stick myself in each one of the roles as if I'm the person that is in Herod's shoes at this moment, or I'm his advisor, or I'm Jesus at that moment, or I'm one of the people in the crowd, or whatever it is. And I try and process it as if not, oh, I would have done different, right? But I would have done what they did because they did, and they were human, and they were all the examples of humanity right there for us, right? So I would have stayed silent as Jesus. I would have sent him away in robes and ridiculed him. I would have stood in the crowd shouting for his death. I would have done those things, but if I put it in, not in a story, not in a what if situation like that, but in a today me, what would that feel like? What would it look like? And how would I live with myself? And how might I go that night and go back and live in my house with my family and look at my child in his eyes and talk to my wife and sleep in my bed after all of this has happened, right? All of those people went forward and lived
Yeah.
their
I could empathize with that because when I started my research, I was like, man, these guys are cowards, they're losers, they're creep. Like even when you look at Antipas on Wikipedia, he looks like a total creep. Like, I came at it from a judgmental perspective, and I broke it down like, okay, how could I see this as, like you said, like as if I were them, if I grew up in a household where everything is just pandemonium, right? You're rich and famous, everything is on the table. You have regular incestual relationships. Like, dude, what is the real emotional states that this guy is going through?
Mm-hmm.
Like trying to get his father's approval, trying to, achieve acceptance of himself through fleshly matters. Like these are the real things to discern to try to get that perspective.
Yeah, that's interesting. So, yeah, Craig, what would you say in terms of how this applies to us? What would you add?
Yeah, I mean, I like that. Those approaches that were just talked about, especially what Jim was saying about putting yourself in their shoes or their position. I mean, we can't expect someone that is not a believer to act the same way that we do in a modern day situation. And so, going back to what I said earlier about Judaism and them following or not following it, if they weren't living a life under the conviction of the Holy Spirit or God and his ways, then surely they didn't give two hoots about that. And they were making decisions based on the perspective that they had for their life, for their outlook, for their view, for what they were charged to do. I mean, if they were supposed to be keeping the peace, what we don't have, although there may be some record of this, not outside the Bible, but we don't have stories of the 100 crucifixions prior to this one. What did those people do, and what was the evidence? What were they doing to cause unrest, and then what was their trial like? It may not have been a whole lot different, if from their perspective. You did this, you're causing unrest. Yeah, we're going to talk about some of the facts of it. You're being called the King of the Jews. What do you do? What do you say about that? What do you say about this? But at the end of the day, you must be punished. And obviously in this case, killed. I don't think that it seems strange to them. I think that after the crucifixion, there was one of the Roman soldiers that's like, "What have we done?" But that was, that was unique, and I'm sure that wasn't something that everybody thought. That was something that a few people thought.
Well, but and because we don't know. I love to think about these scenarios where, what if the power of God throughout all of this, the hand of God through the entire experience, right? His fingerprints, his presence throughout all of this, orchestrating the thing that would give us salvation. What if people actually were experiencing the what have I done? It's just not in the story. What if, as that presence was leaving, as the thing was done, what if lots of people, after the whole thing was no longer like, as soon as your ability to do something to make the situation different than it is gone, and you're settling and just resting and thinking for a minute, what if lots of people along the way, what if soldiers who took him to certain places recognized after it was no longer in their ability to do something about it, then they went, oh man, what have I done? What have I done? What have I done? What have I done? Right. And
I
that's,
think
that's a
in
part of
Acts,
being human too, right?
we have evidence that at least that happened to some degree, because even a lot of the religious leaders that I assume were probably involved in this were now part of the Christian movement. So yeah, that's an interesting point. Just that that presence was working in a very broad way that we don't necessarily know specifics of.
Yeah, and certainly within the Roman rule, even if someone had feelings or thoughts like that, dare not say anything, because what would happen to them, if they were not falling in line, so to speak. And then, of course, within the religious elite of the Jews, they also would not have broken rank, because if everybody around them, especially the higher level leaders, were claiming that this person was a heretic, they're going to say, yeah, they sure are. Even if they had this developing doubt or this developing thought, they would have just gone along with it, because that was not something that they didn't exactly live in America with a Twitter account where they could just kind of claim their own opinion. They kind of had to go along with the flow.
The mobocracy.
Yeah, and especially if you, especially because this was a difference with the Christians in a way, was we were given eternal life in our life in Christ, and so our life in this world was, as Paul says, it's I gain if I die, right? But to the Romans, like, this was their life, and to stand up was to lose that life, which was to lose all that we had. And so it's a different dynamic.
There's a question / just addition. Maybe you guys have some verse in mind to shed light on this, but there has to be something that God offered to non-believers as a path to him outside of the Jews, because the Bible even talks about, like, whenever there's temptation, there's always a way to get out of it that I'm covering with you. And not loving God is a sin, right? So there's got to be a way out of it, an opportunity before Jewish people or outside of Jewish people. Is there something that you guys think of for that?
Well, I mean, I think there's certainly a lot of directions we could go, but Job is a good example of that. He was not a Jew; he was outside of that, and so I think, and there are examples of that in the Old Testament that we can certainly explore and further. But I think the way that I think of it, just generally, is we have a loving Father who loves us, and that the way in which He's done things is to maximize the amount of us that come to Him, that are drawn to Him, that are redeemed. So however He's structured it is for that end game. I may not make sense of all of it or know the details, but that certainly is the way in which I frame it. Would you guys add anything to that?
I think, this is a question that's been asked or talked about, multiple times, and I don't have a perfect answer, but I'll say that there was Adam and Eve were created by God and walked with God in the garden. They sinned, they fell. That implied that they were going to hell. It implied that. It was never really talked about whether there was any sort of reconciliation. Not sure. I think, but there's other people along the way that honored God, that listened to God, and then obviously Abraham. Abraham was not a Jew because it was Abraham and his descendants that were made the promise. So he wasn't a Jew, and then now he was God's chosen, new beginning of a race of people. but there's an implication in there that well, actually, I just remembered something. When the law was given, that was a yoke around the neck of that people group. But Paul in Romans says that the Jews perish under the law, and that everybody else, the Gentiles, perish outside of the law. But it doesn't go into great detail there. There obviously was salvation among these people that were before, and I mean Moses and these that would follow God's commands. So I think it's kind of like it's a level of theology that would be some digging, I think, to try to unpack some of that stuff. But the one thing that I know for sure is that the law itself, as given to the Jews, was so burdensome that they could barely meet it, and really never could fully meet it, and therefore had to sacrifice in order to forgive.
And those sacrifices were an illusion or pointing towards Christ's sacrifice. They were not in themselves.
They were called a schoolmaster. You know,
Yeah.
it was a schoolmaster that was there to teach the ways of obedience to the Father. And then obviously Christ's sacrifice was the fulfillment or the completion of the covenant. It wasn't a replacement covenant. It was a completion of the covenant, which was one of obedience, one of obedience to the Father. And Christ was the ultimate obedience, which then our faith in him gives us his obedience
through the Spirit. Yeah.
Right. So I think that there were, it was there was salvation prior to the law, but it was just different. And it's, I haven't studied that to be able to put a lot of work around it, but.
Yeah, so let's close out here, round robin a bit. What are your final thoughts before we close out here? I think for me, kind of what we were saying a little bit earlier, what you said, Ivan, like when you first jumped into this story, I think just the way in which I've changed just studying the stories is that Jesus saw all of these people and our trophy case of sin. And yet he still did the mission. Like he didn't see it and go, man, these people are so bad. I'm going to pull out. But I think that's a way in which we can look at people, is the way that Jesus did. So, Ivan, what would you say are your final concluding remarks?
Just based on recent history, to address that, I would say there's a point to acknowledge people and their sin, their trophy cases or whatever. But there's also a point to also build a distance. The Bible says, try not to stay too close to an angry man because you might get caught up in his ways. Also, when you're helping a fellow brother with sin, try to also keep some degree of boundaries because you don't also want to jump into the same sin.
Yeah, the boundaries and enforcing them, having them enforced. Yeah.
I've been sort of working through that sort of thing myself in terms of like taking the Bible a little too literally, not catching some of the details last couple of years of just giving too much of myself, not having boundaries, and that compromises me and my walk with God.
Yeah.
So I would just say that as a final comment for me. Thank you all.
Craig, what would your final thoughts be?
So this is a little bit of a new thought that I just had a moment ago, but it'll certainly do as a wrap up thought is, Jesus in the garden, and certainly for his entire ministry, would have very much known, not because he was God, but because he was a Jew under Roman rule, he would have very much known how this was going to play out. Like he would have seen it or have heard about it numerous times of people being dragged before Pilate or before Herod, and the rulings and the punishment and the crucifixion. By the way, I have been to what is believed to be the very site that Christ was crucified on, and the tomb that he was believed to be placed in the area there at Golgotha. And it's both sobering and breathtaking to imagine that you're there, but it's also very unassuming, and it wouldn't have been as beautiful then as it is now. They've gardened it up and made it all pretty with gates and things, but but the thing is you're like, wow, this is a real place. But the point of Golgotha and where it was at a very high place, a cliff of sorts, at the intersection of major roads that went to major cities, and people would have been hanging there. Imagine that you're hanging at the intersection of 85 and 285, and you're just hanging right there, and people are coming and going, and they're seeing it. So the point of that is to say that Jesus would have been very well aware of what these trials were like, what the punishments were like. And I don't think that there was any surprise. I think he would have known very, very, very
Yeah. He knew what he was getting into.
He knew what he was getting into. And I think he would have known very well that there was no point in saying anything. Back to that conversation again. Look, I know how this is going to end. Once you're on the path to that thing, you're not getting out of it. And especially, I'm not getting out of it with everything that have been doing. It wasn't even accused of. He literally was doing the things that they accused him of. The problem is that they didn't see it for what it was. They saw it as heretical, rather than seeing it as the fulfillment of God's promise. And so he's like, so I think that was the tears. I mean, not the tears, the sweating blood and the, Father, let this cup pass from me. It wasn't, I'm afraid of what may happen. It was like, I know what's going to happen. Not even from a God perspective, but just from a Jewish perspective. I know how this is going down.
Yeah. And I do wonder, like, the inevitableness that you're describing. What Jesus often said, don't tell anyone that I did this miracle. Don't, like, I almost wonder if he was trying to slow down what was eventually going to happen.
Very much think that was the case. I think it was a matter of just slowing it down to give him time to have more time with people, more ministry, and to allow things to unfold. Who knows? There might even have been, here's interesting. What if Herod needed to be in Jerusalem for all of this to play out the way that it did? And part of the delays and part of the pace at which he did his ministry was so that Herod would have ended up in Jerusalem. The Passover and the donkey and the palm leaves and the whole 9 yards, like all of that needed to play out the way that it needed to play out. So some of those don't tell anybody's might have been to
like Ivan said, it was like, what did you say? Like 1 in a trillion that all the events unfolded or something. So
well, and
that
even
was profound, Craig. I just have to say that was really profound. The way, like, of course, if you told me you're going to chainsaw my arm off tomorrow, I'm going to hold that off as long as I possibly can. It's
all interesting. How I know the prophecy of he'll hang on a tree.
Yeah.
The Roman Empire didn't even exist when that prophecy was made. And yet the prophecy was made and it panned out to be exactly the way that it was prophesied, and all the different things, the way that they all panned out. Back to the 1 in a million thing, is there were so many things that pointed to him being the Messiah that was promised. And it's just so shocking that not only did they not believe it because of them being so wrapped up in the religious aspect of it, but it's shocking to me that more Jews today don't look back with all of the, the intelligence that we have and all of the sophistication of thought that we have, how they don't look back and say, hey, wait a minute, this was clearly God, clearly Christ.
Well, some of that does happen. Like if you go back and look at, I remember Andy Stanley was talking once. He said he had a friend who was Jewish, and he told him to read, I think it's Isaiah 62, where it describes the suffering Messiah. And his friend read it. It's like, wow, this is like describing Jesus. He thought it was Christians had changed the text. So he went to his rabbi. He said, no, that's what it is. And he had to reconcile. He ended up becoming a Christian. So I think some of it is just like Christians, we don't read our Bibles. I imagine a lot of Jews don't read their Bibles either.
Well, here's something else to keep in mind for people that don't have a Christian faith, and even Jews, and that's what made me think of it. Is I've got a friend in Israel that I met for when I worked for an Israeli company 20 something years ago, and we had a conversation many years ago. He knows nothing about Jesus. He doesn't know the stories. He doesn't know the journey. He doesn't know anything at all because there's been zero reason for him to learn it. There's been zero reason for him to read it. The Jews don't believe that Jesus was the Messiah. And so they're not going to spend their time reading through the New Testament to learn about it. And the same would be true of people that are atheist or Muslim or.
It'd be like, why would we go read the Quran? There's
That's-
nothing compelling us to do it. Right?
That is the exact example that I was just going to give is, why would we go read that when we don't believe it? We don't have any reason to believe it. We have no background that drives us to believe it. So why would we go read it? So bear in mind that the Jews, the modern day Jews and the Jews of, well, certainly the Jews of their time didn't, but the modern day Jews, they have no reason to go read the New Testament. They never have believed, and nothing in their family or their history would lead them to believe that Jesus was the Messiah. Why would they go read about it?
Yeah.
So it's when I realized that many years ago, I was like, well, that's interesting. How can they choose to believe or not believe if they don't even know the story?
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah. Jim, final thoughts, words of wisdom, takeaway.
Yeah, I
Wrap us up.
think. Yeah, I think. I think if you're listening to this, if you're following along, if you're reading the scripture along with this series of podcasts in preparation for Jason's book, I think if you can do the exercise of not, I think when Ivan said it earlier, he was like on first reading or in first approaching the scripture, his initial human reaction was to go, "Oh, these idiots, these jerks! Oh, you're such a sleaze! Oh, why would you do that?" And if you can let this scripture and reading it do the work of just putting you in the place of all of us are human, all of us, right? And there isn't like a bigger, badder sin. There isn't like if I was there, I'd do the right thing. These guys were lacking because they don't have this. We're all human, right? And without God, all of us, like when Ivan had that piece of paper earlier where he showed, right, our spine is this, isn't that what you did earlier, Ivan?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Single piece of
so
paper.
that single piece of paper, like we're one dimensional as far as our spine goes. If we look at the thing and we go, "Oh, Jesus, I'm rooting for you, man, to not get crucified," and all these bad people, all those sinners that don't know you like I know you, man, they were doing all these bad things. No, they're humans. They're many examples of humans, and we are human too, and we need this, and that's why it happened, and it had to happen. So if you're reading through it and you're separating yourself and you're looking at them versus us, or bad people versus good people or whatever, it's just people. It's just humans. It's just the condition. It's just us and what we need and how we're separated and how without this there isn't a next.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jim. Thank you, Craig. Thank you, Ivan, for joining me.
Thank you for thanking us.